Where did you make your start in the world of high performance sport and organisational psychology, Damian?
Well, I've got quite an interesting background, Steve. So I think that was my first introduction into both of those areas of high performance and understanding the psychology of creating high performing environments. So I grew up in a boxing gym in Manchester. So before I was born, my dad had established a boxing gym in the city, and like most people's perceptions of boxing gyms, they often are in quite tough urban inner city areas, and this one was no different. So back in the early 2000s, the area was categorised as being Europe's third poorest ward, just to give you an idea of the sort of social context. But the purpose behind the boxing club was that it was, so my dad trained a number of guys that went on to become world boxing champions. There was a number of Olympic medalists and things, and so people that had real success within the gym. So I saw the high performance element of what it took to perform at an elite level from a really young age. But what the interesting thing was that gym was also a sanctuary for a lot of people that just wanted to come and escape quite difficult circumstances. So there was lots of people that came in there that had never set foot in a boxing ring and had no intention of doing so, but they wanted to almost find a sanctuary from some of the challenges of life, and they were made just as welcome and made and embraced. Now, a nice coda to that was that a few years ago, Manchester Council named a road in tribute to my dad and the work that he'd done. And when they sort of unveiled the road and they had the Lord Mayor of Manchester come down to do it, there must have been about 300 people that turned up. And I'd say that 90% of those people that turned up to pay tribute to my dad had never set foot in a boxing ring. But they wanted to come and pay tribute to the impact that culture and that environment had had on them as parents, as professionals, as partners, and just as members of society. And I think when I sort of started going down the academic route of understanding around organisational psychology, one of the things that I mention is that we often engage in what we call me-search, not research, because we try to make sense of our life and our biographies. And I think as I got older and then reflecting back on that period of my life, I think I started to understand just how powerful culture was within there. So to give you a really simple example, like there was a series of really non-negotiable behaviours that people had to buy into. The moment you crossed that threshold, for example, you weren't allowed to come and use bad language. Now, it wasn't some kind of moral crusade of people being offended by bad language, but what the behaviour that people had to understand was that indicated a lack of discipline. If you walked into an environment and you couldn't think of anything to say or do other than effing and blinding, that indicated a lack of discipline, that you couldn't hold your tongue or find something else to say. And in a boxing gym, a lack of discipline can have some quite serious consequences. So people understood that coming into that environment came with it a really clear set of behaviours and an identity that you needed to assume, which is at the heart of organisational psychology, which is about creating a sense of purpose and a way of behaving once you come into it. So I think those two areas, I was exposed to them at a very young age, and I feel incredibly fortunate that they sort of piqued an interest in me that I've been able to take into my own adult life.
Because the behaviour, the non-negotiable behaviours and the culture that you talk about, as somebody who's followed a lot of the books you've written over the years, it's been a thread that kind of runs through all of them. I think I'm right in saying that it's interesting that it started really early and that it's been almost, continued through all your work.
Yeah, well, so part of the reason I talk about non-negotiable behaviours is because what I see in so many cultures or relationships within a working environment is ambiguity is the big enemy, Steve. So it's that if you walk past me one day and you choose to say hello because you're having a good day, but the next day you're having a bad day and you choose to ignore me, that then creates an ambiguity that I'm not sure where we stand. Does acknowledging each other, is that unacceptable, or is it acceptable that I can challenge you. Whereas if we can establish what those rules of engagement are between us at the start of the relationship or at the start of me joining your company, that then gives me a sense of certainty, and from that certainty allows me to then concentrate on delivering my very best behaviours. So ambiguity is often the enemy, because we allow subjectivity to creep in. We sort of turn a blind eye to it, depending on individuals. And there's lots of powerful reasons why that's the case. Yeah. But the challenge is to understand and identify those non-negotiable behaviours at the start of it. So I've been working on a podcast series similar to what you're doing here, Steve, where called the High Performance Podcast, where I've been interviewing a range of elite performers from sport and business and the arts. And I've been doing it with a friend and a colleague called Jake Humphrey. And that's one of the questions that we ask all of them. What are your three non-negotiable behaviours? And what we get is that there's an immediate response from pretty much everyone we talk about. And they're all very, very crystal clear in the answers that they're giving, in terms of, if you want to be a member of my team, this is the stuff that I'm not prepared to trade on. So we interviewed a guy called Sean Wayne, who's the England Rugby League coach. Yeah. And one of his behaviours is just good manners. And when you ask him why, he goes, because that indicates a respect that says, I don't think I'm better than you. I don't think you're better than me. But we treat each other with a level of courtesy and respect that is just non-negotiable within his world. Now, he's been incredibly successful at developing high-performing cultures in the rugby clubs that he's gone to, and the foundation of it is built on respect. Right.
Yeah. And do you find that with the people you've interviewed, that they don't even have to think about those non-negotiable behaviours? They're just so ingrained that they can just articulate them straight away, or is there?
I think they have thought about it. Yeah. So I think the point is that they've thought about it an awful lot, and then then a lot of their energy is spent in just maintaining them. So we interviewed, say, Rio Ferdinand, and we were talking to him about the culture that he went into at Manchester United. Yeah. And he spoke about three non-negotiable behaviours that he experienced very quickly. He talks about relentlessness, so you never settle. You're constantly working on the next challenge. The second one was courage. So you've got to play with courage, that you've got to take a risk. Sometimes it goes wrong, but risk taking is part of courage. And then the third one is you've got to be a team player. You've got to put the team above your self-interest. Now, when we asked him where they'd come from, he said Alex Ferguson had laid them down in the culture 20 years before he even arrived there. So it was up to him to adapt and integrate into the culture that he'd done. And he feels that those behaviours are now a key part of his own success in life and beyond. So some of them have had to go away and learn these behaviours, but they've all had to reflect on them at some stage in their development to understand them. So I think another really neat example, that when we interviewed Sir Chris Hoy, and we'd arranged to meet him in Manchester, it was a really cold, wet day, and we'd arranged to meet him at 10 o'clock, and at 10 to 10, there's a knock on the door. When we open it, Britain's greatest ever Olympian is stood there. So we said, come in, Chris, nice to see you. And I just said to him, thanks for being here early. It makes it a lot easier for us. And he was like, well, why would I know early? And I was like, well, I know we'd arranged to meet at 10 o'clock. It's cold, it's wet. He was like, we've arranged to meet at 10 o'clock. I'm here for 10 to 10. So I thought, this is an interesting response. So I thought it's a thread worth pulling. So I said, so I sort of explored it a bit more, and the essence of his answer was, he said, if I show up late, that would indicate that I think my time is more important than your time, which would indicate that I think I'm more important than you. And he went, and that shows a lack of respect. It's arrogant. He said, that's just unthinkable. Yeah. Now, in that one anecdote there, if you sort of unpick it, you go, you've got a guy there that is respectful and humble. You've got somebody that is committed and is dependable. Yeah. So you go, did those three characteristics lie at the heart of his success of winning 8 Olympic gold medals? I'd argue, yeah, that's exactly what it was. Given that he had a base level of talent, but then the fact that he had humility to want to learn, he was he was committed when he trained. He gave it everything, and then he was dependable. If he said he was going to race at a certain time, he would deliver on that time. Yeah. That's what you want. So I think there's no coincidence, I would say, that all elite performers, whether this is individuals or whether this is people that are part of teams or cultures, are really, really gimlet-eyed in terms of knowing these are the standards of behaviour that we're not prepared to compromise on. And then what that allows people to do is, if you think of that term commitment implies a choice. Now, you might go into a culture where you go, this isn't for me, and that's fine. Maybe it doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you're not in a place where you're going to thrive.
Yeah.
Whereas for other people, when they get in there, they go, this is exactly what I need. And therefore, they're more likely then to go on and focus and thrive within that environment.
Yeah. And that's the bit I find really interesting, whether, as you say, whether it's in the world of sport or the world of business. It's that, because there's a lot of talented people out there. There are a lot of talented cyclists and footballers and rugby players and business people.
Yeah.
But what separates the ones who become really successful is the deliberate practice they put in place for not just the sport or the technical or the skill thing they're doing, but how they go about doing it, which is, as you've articulated, the kind of behaviour side of things.
Well, I was reading over the weekend, Arsene Wenger's got a book out, and he uses a great phrase. He talks about invisible training. So the invisible training is the stuff that happens not on the field.
Yeah.
So it's about how you prepare, how you live your life, how you prepare your diet, your nutrition, and things like that. And I would argue the invisible training stuff is exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
The behaviours that you do in your private life will manifest themselves in your when you come under pressure. So if you get into the habit of making excuses or pointing the finger or blaming other people, when you come under pressure, that then becomes the default habit that your brain takes a path of least resistance, and you demonstrate those same behaviours.
Yeah. So it's about breaking unhelpful habits and forming some helpful ones, ideally.
Sometimes it can be, but I'd say the key bit, Steve, is just there's a really nice exercise I encourage anyone to do if they're listening to this, and say, think about your best moments, think about your best successes, think about your biggest achievements, and rather than think about the outcome of what you achieved, break it down into how did you achieve it. So not what did you do, but how did you do it? What were the behaviours that were present when you were successful? And that's your starting point to then go, right, so then start looking for evidence and say, when I've demonstrated these behaviours, what tends to happen in my world? And you'll find that there's a correlation between some of them, that whenever success occurs in your life, these behaviours are present. And then the challenge is, how do you get more of these occasions where you show up in the way that defines success for you?
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Stretch Podcast. I hope you're enjoying today's topic. If you have some thoughts, opinions, or a perspective on what we've been talking about, then why not leave them in the comments below, as we'd love to hear from you. Also, please remember to hit that like button and hit subscribe if you'd like to hear more of our content in the world of professional coaching. When subscribed, remember to click on the little bell icon to turn on notifications. That way you won't miss when a new episode drops. Let's get back to the discussion.
As well as interviewing and speaking to, elite sports performers, you get involved and have been involved in helping teams create these cultures and behaviours. In recent memory, the Scottish rugby union team and things like that. So just for our listeners, just tell us a little bit about your direct involvement in sport, if you wouldn't mind doing.
Yeah, so to put it in some kind of context, I work across quite a wide range of organisations. So I do a little bit in the corporate world. I do stuff in education, but I also do work in elite sport. And I tend to work alongside coaches of teams that want to create high-performing cultures, is the challenge that they want. So it's not just about winning, it's about how do you build a culture that can win and then sustain it. Yeah. So based on my experiences over the years, so I've been doing this for a long time, so about over 15 years of working in elite sport. So I've made an awful lot of mistakes along the way doing that. And I think based on those mistakes, what I realise is that my work can be more effective if I work with the coaches pretty much exclusively. And the reason I say that is that, say if I go and stand up in front of a room full of rugby players, if I stand up and start making suggestions, at best I reckon I'll get about 70% buy-in from the room.
Right.
That they might respect you, or they might think that your ideas have got merit, but there'll be around 30% of the room that go, what do you know about rugby?
Yeah.
And therefore, I fall down on the credibility gap that I'm in their world and I don't understand enough about their world for them to buy into it.
Yeah.
Whereas if I can work with a head coach who can stand up and deliver the same messages with my support, I reckon he'll get 90% buy-in.
Yeah.
Because he's got the credibility and he also wields influence that he picks a team or not. So based on that, I tend to work with leaders, whether that's in sport or in business, that and almost equip them with the skills to be able to go and create high-performing cultures. And then my role after that is to almost be a support for them. So I become another pair of eyes and ears that I can support them and observe them and see what's happening and maybe intervene where necessary. But that's very much the role that I do. So, like I say, last 3 years I've been working with Gregor Townsend on the coaching staff for the Scotland Rugby Union team. I've been working out in Canberra in the NRL with the Canberra Raiders as well. And then over the years, I've worked across a range of sports. From I worked with Tracy Neville with the England Roses netball team, through to organisations in like football teams in the Premier League and Super League and the Rugby Premiership as well.
Yeah. Well, if you ever fancy giving Newcastle United a hand, we could probably talk about there. But it's always held up, elite sports. That the lessons from elite sports are always used as the kind of metaphor analogy for business, right? It's been, it's been around for a long time and it continues, and a lot of that's really, really useful because it gives you, even though it's a different context and a different environment, it gives you something to kind of get a hold of and articulate this type of stuff. But having been working with sport as close as you have, what is sport's Achilles heel, do you think? What could sport do better in terms of creating these high performing cultures, do you think?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. I'd say I'm familiar with you that as you are, Steve, around this idea of sport is often used as a metaphor for business and things like that. And I urge anybody whenever I hear that, I cringe a little bit because I think the parallels get forced together more than what they necessarily are. So I get why people do it, but sport is pure in many ways. That you know who wins and you know who loses, and that's why. So it's quite easy to go and look at the winners and go, it's because they do this. But business isn't like that. Business isn't as clear cut as that in organisations, and so that's one difference that I think makes it a little bit more ambiguous or vague. But there's other differences as well that I think are pretty significant and why the analogy of sport into business doesn't work. The second reason I'd give is that the way people will often speak to each other within the sporting environment, whilst it might be acceptable within that kind of context, just wouldn't be tolerated within any other context or outside of that world.
Yeah.
So some of the conduct of people within it is very different. And then the third thing I'd say is that there's some practices that go on within the sports environment that employment law wouldn't allow that to happen. The way that they speak to each other, and quite right as well.
Yeah.
But then the third thing, to emphasise, is that there's you can drop people, you can get rid of people a lot easier in professional sport than employment law would allow you to do within an organisation. So I think those three differences in terms of the winning and losing is clearer. The conduct is very different, that is seen as more acceptable within sport. And the punitive measures of being able to get rid of people at the end of contracts or drop them mean that the parallels between sport and business fall down there and there alone. I think the things that we have in common is an area that I'm lucky enough to work in, where I say I don't work in sport, I work with people. that work within the industry of sport. And I think the people elements of what we're describing are just as similar. I think people working under pressure, people having to create a cohesive team in a diverse organisation. I think communication and making sure there's an alignment of messages. I think all of that, there's lots of things you can learn from the world of sport, but equally I think sport can learn from the world of business.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about people here. The industry might be different, but the people element's the same. So that's how I'd argue. In terms of what sport's Achilles heel, I think sometimes sport can be quite slow to recognise the benefit. I think because people take sport and the analogies from there and then take them outside of sport. I'm not always sure that it's a two-way process. I'm not sure sport takes business practices and embraces them as readily as it happens the other way around.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess you touched on something there that I was going to ask you, and go back to what you said before around, standing up in front of a group, whether it's Gregor Townsend with the Scotland rugby team or whether it's, whoever it might be, getting that sort of, wanting to do something different, trying to get engagement, and you might get 90%. I guess when you're trying to change a team or a group or even the entire organization's culture, then buy-in, obvious statement of the day, buy-in is pretty important. So how, in your opinion, whatever context you care to think about, really, sport or business, what does it take to really impact that group's culture, do you think?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think, first of all, I think to answer the question, you need to understand, well, what type of culture do you want? So the reality is when we start back from this, say, well, there are different types of cultures that can exist within an organisation. So in some organisations, they can have like an autocratic culture.
Yeah.
And that's where you've got a leader that just sets a tone and it's my way or the highway. So you might get that, say, in the startup business where you've got the founder, or you might have, in a slightly bigger business, you might have a charismatic chief exec. That can be one type of culture. Another type of culture is a star culture, where you just rely on some superstars that deliver results.
Yeah.
And it tends to be about keeping them happy. You might have a bureaucratic culture, which is about middle managers. And this is about everyone playing by the rules and the regulations that you have. And engineering culture is another type where it's about, have you got the skills to do the job? You're recruited to do a specific job, and we just need to make sure that your skill set can execute that. But when we talk about a good culture, a high-performing culture, the academic lingo for that, Steve, is a commitment culture. And a commitment culture is, what's our purpose? So what we're working towards, and making sure that everyone's bought into that. And then it goes back to the first question about what are our behaviours? What are our non-negotiable behaviours? So I think that has to be the starting premise, that you have a really clear sense of direction and a set of rules about how you intend to get there. And I think what that allows people to do is you can have people that will opt in, or you can have people that opt out.
Yeah.
So again, to go back to the podcast, we did an interview with a guy called Mauricio Pochettino, who was the head coach at Tottenham. And he's really clear about his non-negotiable behaviours. He talks about you have to bring positive energy into an environment. You have to have the right attitude. So you have to be able to take responsibility for setbacks. And then the third thing is you've got to be a team player. Now, what he said is he's not prepared to compromise on those. But he had a really neat way of describing it. He said, but if that's not for you, that doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that you're going to work in an environment where we're not going to get the best out of you.
Yeah.
So he said, so we need to maybe consider how we find the right environment for you to go to, but accept that you probably won't fit or be successful within our environment. So I think by starting on the direction and the how you intend to get there, that allows people then, if they sign up to come on board with you, there's almost like there's a transparency and a consistency that's at play, which you need to have. Another element you need to have is give people the skills to be able to cope with adversity, because this isn't a linear straight line. When you're trying to make progress towards anything that's challenging, there's going to be bumps along the way. So you need to give people that, like, there's a study called the Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting that says, what do people remember about any kind of project? And they remember the start and they remember the end. And then they'll remember the worst moment in the middle.
Right.
So you need to almost have a plan in place that says, how are you going to handle, I call them oh shit moments, the moments where the roof falls in on you.
Yeah.
And how you respond at those moments will help define the culture. So you need to have a sense of understanding what that looks like. And then you need the role of cultural architects is the phrase I use, but these are your leaders without title. These are the people that run the show for you. That they don't necessarily need the title of being a leader, but they just identify with what you're trying to do, and they will defend the culture regardless of being popular. They'll defend it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think so. They're just some of the elements that I'd argue have to be present for success to follow.
Yeah. And I guess with the sort of cultural architects, I guess you know, for anybody listening to this, you know, I would imagine most of us have been through a time at work where we're trying to get a new initiative, whether it be a cultural change or whatever, and we've got to gain buy-in. Yeah. I guess it's just establishing the people who are going to champion it and defend it, like you've said, to the point where actually it either brings the rest of the group along, or as you've said, if we've been really transparent about what it is and it isn't, those people can, you know, opt out or, you know, can find something else that is more appropriate. A little bit later on.
Yes, so I think you're absolutely right. I think the role of architects are the people that work in the shadows in many ways. So if you think about when you make a decision, so when you're in the workplace, there's two ways that you make a decision. Say you see somebody behaving in a way that doesn't fit the culture. Maybe they're gossiping about a colleague.
Yeah.
One way you might make a decision what to do is you make a cost versus benefit analysis. You go, right, do I feel like I've got enough to be able to challenge them, to disagree, to do this? And if it comes down on the side of, I probably don't feel confident enough, you turn a blind eye to it and you pretend that you didn't hear them gossiping.
Yeah.
The other way that you make a decision is you do it through identity, and identity asks three questions. You say, who am I? What's the situation? What would somebody like me do in this situation? So you're not worried about being popular. You just say, hey, that's not acceptable. That's not what we agreed there. So you're not worried about popularity. You're worried about doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Now, the reality is you need to have, in any organisation, people that do the right thing rather than the popular thing. And these are your cultural architects, and you need enough of these that are doing this in the shadows. Because the phrase I sometimes use is, it's like you're building the culture brick by brick, story by story, moment by moment is what defines it. So there's a rugby coach called Ben Ryan that says that what you permit within an organisation becomes the standard. So if you choose to walk past those colleagues gossiping and say nothing, you permit it, and therefore that becomes the standard. So cultural architects are your eyes and ears when nobody else is watching in many ways.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, you've written extensively on leadership. Just to ask you about leadership, you know, from books about Alex Ferguson to Pep Guardiola, his time at Barcelona, in the football world, obviously. So from all these people that you've studied and you know, spent time writing about and been around, what do you think, you know, in the context of 2020, where we are, which is a very volatile and ambiguous time to say the least, but just where we are in 2020, what do you think it takes to be an effective leader?
Wow, that's a brilliant question. So if we had to nail it down to the priorities, I'd say emotional intelligence is a key characteristic of effective leaders at this moment in time. That, you know, everybody's world has had to change massively for better or worse, but it's changed regardless of it. And I think emotional intelligence gives us the capacity to acknowledge that change to understand that some people find it difficult, and then to be able to move at their pace rather than just make demands of people regardless of it. So I'll give you a neat story. Many years ago, I went to Detroit, to a boxing gym in Detroit while I was doing some research for a book, and I met a guy called Emmanuel Stewart. And the boxing gym I went to visit was in a really tough, deprived part of a deprived city. And when I got there, I was feeling quite nervous, and Manny Stewart sort of met me and he said, Damian, how do you feel coming here? And I thought he was being polite, so I gave him a polite answer. I said, I'm really excited, thanks for having me. He said, that's really kind. He said, now tell me the truth. And his demand sort of opened up, and I started saying to him, I feel nervous, I know you're busy, I don't want to get in your way, I appreciate how much you've got on your plate and things like that.
Yeah.
And when he sort of finished, he said, thank you for being honest. He said, that now means me and you can do some really good work together. And when I got to know Manny a little bit better, I asked him about what that approach he'd taken on the day that I met, because I didn't flatter myself and assume he was doing that just for me. And he summed up emotional intelligence in 3 really succinct words. He said, when I work with anybody, I work on the basis of contain, then explain.
Okay.
And what he means by that is, this is emotional intelligence. He says, I can't start making demands of you until you know that I care about you, that I'm interested in you, that I know your story, that I understand how you're feeling, that you trust me, that you feel safe in me. He said, so there's no point in me saying to you, go and do this until we've established that. So he says, his description of contain is, I've got to spend time getting to know you and the person you are before I can then start to explain how we're going to work together. Yeah. But those that suffer with a lack of emotional intelligence, they do it the opposite way. They explain and then contain. They tell you what you've got to do and then try and convince you to give a shit about you afterwards, or if you've done it or not. And it doesn't work in that order. Emotional intelligence is contain, then explain. You know, there's a quote in there, I think it's from Maya Angelou, that says, people don't know how much you care, or don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Yeah. And I think that sums up Manny Stewart's contain and explain element. So I'd say that has to be the starting point for any leader, especially in sort of turbulent, uncertain times that we live in.
Yeah. And it would, it would be remiss not to talk about COVID and the impact it's had on the global economy, obviously. How do you see it affecting, either an individual level or a team level? How do you see COVID impacting high performance?
I think it's a really fascinating question. The answer is, on a personal level, I think that we were talking off air before we started recording. I think it's been a brilliant reminder of the fundamentals of life. So I know you've got 2 little ones. My 2 are slightly older than yours. But before we became parents, my wife and I realised how little we knew about parenting. We went on a parent skills course quite early on because we were thinking, we don't know what we don't know. Let's go and find out. Yeah. And the reality was, this course was brilliant in its simplicity. They did a really simple exercise where they said, think back to your own childhood and write down your best memories. So we did that, and the other people in the course did it. And then the facilitator on the course said, what do you notice about it? And when we looked at the list, there was like a wide variety, but there was 2 things that stood out. One, the activities you remember didn't cost a lot of money. So it was like things like playing in the park, climbing trees, things like that. And then the second thing was your mum and dad were present. So you remember the occasions where your mum and dad were there with you. Yeah. When you think of your own childhood. And I was reminded of that quite early on when we went into lockdown, that I thought, well, you can't do all that, there's not a lot you can do other than you can go for walks together. You can do quite simple things. Yeah. And also as well, the sort of change to diaries and commitments meant that you could be there as well. And I thought it was a time to embrace some of the simple things in life on a really personal level that I found really, really quite powerful and quite humbling in many ways. Yeah. But in terms of what it's going to mean on a grander scale, I think it's going to force us all to think, and thinking is uncomfortable. We don't like thinking. So I sometimes use an analogy that say, have you ever been on holiday to places where you go abroad and people don't speak English?
Yeah.
And you see the typical Brit abroad trying to order a drink at the bar, and the bar staff don't understand them. Yeah. You tell me, Steve, how does the typical Brit abroad deal with that communication difficulty?
They basically just say it a bit louder normally.
Exactly. They do two things. They either speak louder or slower. Now, as you're watching them, do you think they become more comprehensible or more obnoxious in the process of it?
Yeah, certainly the latter, I would say.
Right, exactly. So I think that people that are going to try and do work in the same way in this COVID world that they were doing before it are the equivalent of the Brit abroad trying to order a drink in their own language. That you're just shouting louder and speaking slower, but you don't become more efficient. You just become more obnoxious. Yeah. So I think it's going to force us to go back to first principles and think about how we do what we do and how we do it. Now, that'll be different for every industry.
Yeah.
But whoever can think fastest, it will be the ones that will emerge from this, the ones that are not just going to keep banging the same drum, but go back and think about thinking, are the ones that are going to thrive in this post-COVID world.
Yeah. And I guess something that is required from anybody, I guess literally anybody, but certainly somebody trying to lead a team or a group through all of this, resilience would be pretty a useful trait too, and being able to look after one's well-being and also the well-being of the team.
Yeah,
it's something that we spend a lot of our time talking to people about, whether through coaching conversations or group conversations about resilience and well-being and all things of that nature. So what do you think is the best way to maintain a sort of high level of well-being, wellness, personal resilience? Because I guess a lot of people will be, as you say, thinking about that type of thing at the moment. It'll be challenged in a different way.
Well, when I hear people talk about resilience, I often pause for reflection and say, I've yet to meet anyone that needs to be resilient in the face of kindness and decency and empathy.
Yeah.
I've never met anyone say, I need to armour plate myself against somebody treating me with understanding and dignity. But I've met lots of people that need to be resilient in the face of dealing with dickheads or dealing with difficulty or dealing with people that are unkind or unsympathetic. So I think if we start from that premise of, are you surrounding yourself with people that behave with decency and empathy, or are you surrounding yourself with an environment of unkindness and a lack of sympathy? So have a look at the environment you're in first of all, because I think that's a really interesting place to start when it comes to resilience. And when I talk about kindness as well, I'd level that as at how you treat yourself.
Yeah.
That I think that whether you're kind to yourself or whether you're berating yourself or beating yourself up, again, is a really interesting premise to look at, because I think when you come at the world with a lens of kindness, there's I think what follows from that is a natural resilience that we all have to be able to handle things a lot better. So that'd be the first place I'd start with. And then secondly, I'd accept that I'd spend time again, I'll go back, I'll reference one of the podcast interviews we did.
Yeah.
We interviewed a guy called Ant Middleton that was a former SAS soldier. He's on like Channel 4 with programs like that.
That's right, yeah.
And one of the premises that he spoke about was conducting pre-mortems. And I was like, what does that mean? Yeah, and he was like, before they ever went on a mission, he said to avoid post-mortems, we would conduct pre-mortems. So they would look at what could kill this mission, what could go wrong that could get us killed.
Yeah.
And what the evidence says is, if you make the time to think about how you're going to handle these difficult moments, we referenced it early on in the interview as oh shit moments.
Yeah.
But if you look at how you're going to handle those moments, what evidence says is you can improve your resilience to difficult moments by about 33%. simply by anticipating them.
Yeah.
So first of all, kindness, and then secondly, anticipate difficult moments and just work out a plan in your head of how you're going to handle them. They're two simple ways in which you can improve and develop resilience.
Yeah. And there's things that just anybody can do, aren't there, basically? What you've just described. Anybody can just sit and do it. Yeah. So we talked about high performance, and I just want to get a bit more specific in terms of teams, high performing teams, because they're pretty rare, actually, is my reflection on it. Not every team is high performing. It might be good and it'll get the job done, but when we're talking about real high performing teams, they tend to be quite rare in my experience. And it's obvious, really, when you think about it, the variables that are at play, people's different preferences, the behaviours, beliefs, attitudes, all the things that a group of people bring together.
Yeah.
So what have you found, when we're really focusing on teamwork, that are like the foundational, the foundational things that get a group to not just exist together in an office, but to really kind of knock it out of the park, so to speak?
Yeah. Psychological safety, they're two words that are easy to bandy around, but require an awful lot of investment. So the phrase comes from the work of Amy Edmondson. She was an organisational psychologist. In the early 90s, she was studying healthcare department. So she was going into hospitals predominantly, and she was looking at what makes a high-performing hospital and what stops it. And one of the things that she discovered quite early on in her analysis was the best performing hospitals had the highest near misses or recorded incident rates.
Right.
Which on the surface you go, well, hang on, how can they be a high performing hospital and yet they have so many errors and mistakes and cock-ups in them? Whereas a worse performing hospital had nowhere near those same levels of reported near misses. So that was what led her to start pulling that thread a little bit more. And what she discovered was the best hospitals had the highest reported misses because of this term psychological safety, that when you made a cock-up or a mistake, you could put your hand up and admit it without worrying about the consequences of being disciplined or being sacked or people hammering you for doing it. So therefore, you could learn faster, get smarter, and implement better performance. The worst performing hospitals, people were afraid to put their hand up and admit a mistake because of the consequences or the feared consequences. So instead, you'd keep your head down, you'd point the finger at other people, and you'd look to apportion blame elsewhere. So I think if we start from the premise that mistakes are going to happen, have you got an environment where people feel safe enough to put their hands up and admit it? And therefore the organisation and the team can learn faster and smarter than a team where people look to prevaricate or to point the finger. So I think though that's a starting point for all high performing teams, which is this idea of psychological safety. And I think so many things, almost it's like a spring where so many things flow from it. So you get, on the basis of that, you get a level of trust. So when a leader can therefore hold their hands up and say, I made a mistake here, that develops a level of trust with the rest of the team that say, I'm safe to make a mistake here because the leader has already confessed it. So trust is a consequence of psychological safety. Learning is a consequence of psychological safety. So all of these things are easy to dismiss, that they almost go, oh yeah, this is about group hugging, this is about doing high fives, this is all the soft skills. But in my experience, without the soft skills, you don't get to deliver the sustained hard results that high performing teams have. So I'd say that a lot of teams that don't achieve sustained high performance is because they don't value these softer skills as much as teams that do achieve this the sustained levels.
It almost makes me wince when you get people who are so concerned with what they call the hard stuff to call it the soft stuff, because for me all the stuff you've just described is the stuff that's bloody hard to get right. There's nothing soft about it, really.
But it can be intangible in so many ways, Steve, and that's where the problem is that you say, so how do you measure this? How do you quantify it? And because you can't see it on a spreadsheet, it's easy to denigrate it or devalue it. And yet, like you say, you go into a high performing team, you can just feel it. You just feel, hang on, there's something happening there. Similarly, I'm sure you made reference to it earlier. You go into a toxic culture, you can't explain why it's toxic, but it's something quite visceral.
Yeah.
You just know you're in an environment that doesn't
Yeah.
feel particularly healthy. So these are things that can't necessarily be quantified in terms of hard measures, but actually they precede the numbers that follow.
So just taking into account the many people your work has led you to meet over the years, who surprised you the most and why?
Wow, that's a really good question. Wow. I think like somebody like Sir Alex Ferguson is a really good example, because I think if you look at him from the outside, I think the media perception of him is that he was a bully, that he was like the hairdryer, is that patented phrase of him screaming and bawling people out. I think the sort of tyrannical figure standing on the touchline pointing at his watch is sort of like a media caricature. But it's easy to forget that it is a caricature, because if you were to believe that perception of him being a tyrant and a bully, you'd also have to accept that he defied millions of years of evolutionary psychology to be able to still deliver 26 years of sustained success by doing that. And I think what my experience of sort of meeting him and being around people that knew him a lot better than I did was, they talk about decency, respect, humility, understanding. And these are all things that don't look good as a newspaper headline. And they don't sell many newspapers on the back of it. There's not many anecdotes to be told about him being kind or decent or empathetic. But the reality is that was the experience of people that worked for him within that culture. So it was a good reminder for me that sometimes that you need to look beyond the headlines to find out more about an individual. So it's a bit of an easy answer to give, but it's one that I think there's an eternal truth that lies at the heart of it, that don't judge a book by its cover. Don't listen to headlines or just what people will tell you. Try and find out yourself and try and dig a bit deeper.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think most people listening will be surprised to hear an empathetic, kind Alex Ferguson for the reasons you've just said, because all we hear is the complete opposite. But
well, I mean, I remember somebody sort of saying that to me about it once when I was sort of reflecting on it, and it's like, well, the obvious question is, do you believe everything you read in the newspaper? And I think most people go, well, no, I don't, except that there might be some mistruths or it might be exaggerated. And you go, well, why? So why? How can you say that then, and then still maintain that your view of him is right based on that little sliver that you see on a Saturday afternoon or whenever you're watching the football?
Yeah, interesting. And just a final question, Damian, in terms of your agenda, what's the next big thing you're looking forward to next in your journey?
I've been working on this podcast series, the High Performance Podcast. So we started it last year, and the third series launches next week. And on the basis of that, what that's led me to do is we've done now over 50 of these interviews with elite performers, and it's led me to start looking at pulling together a book based on the ideas behind it, because I think there's some great anecdotes that these people share that from their worlds, but I'm trying to sort of distill it down to, well, how can anybody listening to that or picking up a book and reading it, how can they take their lessons and apply them in their own world? So that's what I spent a lot of lockdown doing, sort of going through the notes and trying to find some replicable skills that people can take away from it. So that's been taking up a lot of my time at the moment, as well as doing the interviews. So I'd say I'm immersed in the research stage of it. But it's just that we're putting the research out there as podcasts every week as well. So people can hear the research themselves, but I'm trying to dig a bit deeper. So that's taking up a lot of time at the moment. And another big thing for me is just trying to keep some of those truths that I spoke about, the lockdown initially in COVID. It forced me to do a bit of a reappraisal about the speed at which I was living my life and what was really important for me. So I'm trying to get a better balance that allows me to be kinder to myself and to the people that really matter in my life, as well as doing the stuff like I just described that I still find really stimulating and enjoyable. So that seems like it's a constant high wire act of trying to get that balance right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we look forward to reading that book when it's finished and when it's published.
It's nowhere near finished. I'm just in the early research stage. And there's no publisher attached to it or anything like that. It's just, at the minute, it's just for my interest.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, Damian, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights.
I know the quality of the work that you do, Stephen. I was really grateful that you invited me on, so thank you for having me and thanks for asking such really incisive, stimulating questions from me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Damian.
Thank you.